In this video, we're going to stub out our next big system. So what we need to do is we need to have this be an actual game. So far, we have some elements of a game, like character controller, camera controller, and that fun stuff, but it doesn't really have an objective. We don't really have checkpoints and all that fun stuff. So what we're going to do is I'm going to stub out the different aspects of the code that we're going to need in order to handle things like points, checkpoints, and the death of a player. Now, we're not going to handle the health of a player yet, but we are going to handle the death of a player. And that means that we'll be able to have a script that kills the player, such as those punji sticks that you see right there, though we won't have any representation of the player's health quite yet. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to fire up Visual Studio, and I'm going to be creating all these classes just directly in Visual Studio, as opposed to going into Unity, going to the project window, hitting create C# script. I'm just going to create the files right up here in Visual Studio. And I'll be using the Alt Insert functionality of ReSharper to generate classes. An alternative would be to right-click the code folder, hit Add, and then hit Class, and then type in a class name, if you wanted to do that the slow way, or if you don't have ReSharper installed. Okay, so a couple classes that we have to write is, first of all, we have to write our level manager. Now, our level manager is going to be a mono behavior, and it is going to be a singleton. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that the level manager, there will only ever be one of the level manager in a level, and it'll be globally accessible, meaning that other objects will be able to access the level manager instance directly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the namespace declaration here, because this will be a mono behavior. And in fact, none of the classes that I'm going to be adding to this project will have namespaces, because again, Unity has difficulty with namespaces. So just to make things straightforward, I'm just going to keep this class not in a namespace. And then I'm going to manually add the using a Unity engine definition up top, because we'll be using that quite frequently in this class. Now, this class will inherit mono behavior, so we have to add :mono behavior in it, otherwise we won't be able to use it in Unity. And I'm going to go ahead and stub out some of, or pretty much all of the public interface for level manager. So I'm going to say public static level manager instance, and it's going to be get private set. So when the level manager is instantiated, he's going to set his public static instance property to himself, and this is the property that we're going to use to retrieve the current level manager that we're looking at. Note the static keyword, that is important. Next up, as far as some other public things, let's do a public player get private set, and let's do a public camera controller camera get private set. The reason I'm putting these in here is just so that we have a we have our player and camera easily accessible from anywhere in our code by just accessing the level manager, then accessing the player or accessing the camera. Okay, so that's mostly going to be, those are going to be some of our big public properties. We're going to add some more public properties later, but let's go ahead and stub out our methods next. So I'm going to go ahead and write a public void awake method, which will be filling in with initialization, a public void start method, which will be putting some more initialization in there, a public void update method, which we'll be using to determine which checkpoint the player is currently on, and then I want to do a public void kill player method, and then a private IEnumerator kill player co, which will simply yield break for now. Notice that by using IEnumerator, we brought in a using system collections at the top. So private IEnumerator kill player co is going to be a coroutine, which we'll show you guys how to write, that will perform the actual murdering of the player. Notice again that it's private. Publicly, you'll invoke kill player, but kill player will privately invoke kill player co. Okay, so next thing that we should do is we should go ahead and write up our checkpoint setter. So I'm going to go into code, I'm going to create a class, and I'm just going to write a public class called checkpoint. Remove the namespace. Have it using Unity engine at the top. Have checkpoint implement or inherit from mono behavior. Now at the moment, our checkpoint will be mostly blank, but we definitely will need some public methods on it. Let's go ahead and write our public method, public void start. Then let's go ahead and write a public void player hit checkpoint. This will be a method invoked by the level manager when the player hits this checkpoint. We'll have a private IEnumerator of, and notice that brought in a using statement for system.collections. We'll have a public IEnumerator of player hit checkpoint co, which will take in a bonus parameter. We'll talk about that later. Then let's go ahead and do a public void player left checkpoint. This method will actually always be empty. We're not going to be having to put any code inside of it for this video series, but I like to have a little bit of consistency. We have a player hit checkpoint, and we'll have a player left checkpoint when he leaves that checkpoint or he reaches a checkpoint after that. Then we'll need a public void spawn player. That will spawn the player at this checkpoint. And then we'll need a public void assign object to checkpoint. And that method will actually take in a object as a parameter, but it'll take in an interface that I haven't implemented yet and won't until we talk about points. Okay, so that gives us our checkpoint. Our checkpoint will be the object that we use to determine where the checkpoints exist in the level. So now we have our checkpoint and our level manager. Let's go into our player and add some additional methods in him that will allow us to mark him as dead and also allow us to have him be respawned. So let's go into the player class. Let's scroll down to underneath public, because I want to write a couple public methods. I don't want to add this method underneath my private methods, just because I think that code is a little bit cleaner when you have the majority of your public methods higher up in the file than underneath other private methods. So we'll definitely want a public void kill method. The kill method will mark this player as dead. Then we want a public void respawn at method that takes in a transform called spawn point. So these two methods, again, won't have an implementation yet, but we will add to these methods as time goes on, and we will be invoking these methods from the other objects that we will be implementing in a video or two. So that's the kill and the respawn at. The next thing that we want to go ahead and do is write our game HUD. So I'm going to come up here to code, and I'm going to add another class. I'm going to call it game HUD, and I'm going to remove the namespace declaration. I'm going to make it a mono behavior, which of course will bring in a using Unity engine at the top. Our game HUD will have a public GUI skin with a public void on GUI method. And again, we won't have an implementation for this code yet until a video in the future. Okay, we still have another class to write, and that is going to be our game manager. Now, our game manager is basically going to be a class that's responsible for keeping track of our points and having that information persist between levels. So there's not going to be a whole lot of information in game manager, but I do want to write a game manager. So let's go ahead and write a game manager class. Remove the namespace and have it implement mono behavior, which of course will bring in a using Unity engine at top. Then we'll have a public int points method, get private set. We'll have a public void reset method. We'll have a public void add points method into points. Then, of course, we're going to want this to be a singleton, so we'll have a public static game manager instance with a getter that right now will simply return null. And the reason I'm returning null right there is, I'm just wanting to write the public interface for these few classes that we're writing so that we can add them into Unity and all that fun stuff. Which, speaking about adding into Unity, Game Manager is not a mono behavior. Whoops. Yeah, we definitely don't want Game Manager to be a mono behavior because it's, in order to have made Game Manager a mono behavior, we would have to mark it as don't destroy on load, because otherwise, when we go to a new level, that object would be destroyed. We're not going to make this a mono behavior because we're just using the Game Manager as a bag to contain data. And also our Game Manager will give us points, or give us a place to add code where we would reset the game or where we would add points to the game. Alright, so I think that wraps up the classes that we have to write, our Game Manager, Game HUD, Player, Checkpoint, and Level Manager. Let's jump into Unity and actually place these game objects into our level so that when we write them, they'll start appearing in the game. Again, I kind of like just stubbing out our classes first and then adding them into Unity and then slowly working on the implementation of those classes. So let's come up back into Unity. Let's go ahead and create a new game object, just create empty, and I'm going to call this, how about managers? Now inside of managers, I want to add a couple components. First of all, I want to add the level manager component. So that'll create the level manager. Next up, I want to create the game HUD component, and that'll create the game HUD. Now it doesn't have a skin set, so I do want to go ahead and create a GUI skin that we'll be using for the remainder of this series and place it into the skin property so that we don't have to worry about setting the skin to something in the future. I'm going to come down here to Project and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder Resources. The reason I'm calling this folder Resources is because we are going to be loading this game in, or this game HUD, this GUI skin in from a script. So in addition to setting our GUI skin to our game HUD as a public field, we are also going to have a GUI skin that will be accessible from being dynamically loaded by a script. And in order for you to dynamically load an object in Unity via a script, you have to place that asset in a folder called Resources. So once I've created that folder called Resources, and again the name of that folder is important, I'm going to go to Create, and I'm going to create a GUI skin, and I'm going to call this GUI skin game skin. Yeah, that seems like a fairly sane name for that. And I'm going to make sure that game skin is in Resources. Now that I've created that GUI skin, I'm not going to do anything with it yet, but I'm going to come up here to Managers, and I'm going to click and drag game skin into skin so that that reference is now created. Okay, the final thing I want to do is create a couple checkpoints. So let's go ahead and do that. To create a checkpoint, we just create an empty game object, and let's call this level start. And let's just go ahead and parent it to managers, or child it to managers, so that it's placed there. And what level start's going to be is it's going to be a game object with a component called checkpoint. And that's going to give it the behavior of being a checkpoint. In addition, I'm going to come up here to this little cube right here with that little down arrow, and I'm going to select something like, how about this red bubble. Okay, so we have a level start. We're going to set level start. We're going to move it. Oh, come on. It's not going to let me move it, is it? We're going to move it. There we go. Over here to where the player is. Then I'm going to duplicate level start. And I'm going to go over, let's say right here, and I'm going to mark this as, let's say, checkpoint 1. And then I'm going to extend my level a little bit by adding some more of these grass tiles, which looks like I kind of messed up right there. There we go. So I'm going to duplicate these 3 level tiles, and then I'm going to come here to checkpoint 1, and I'm going to duplicate checkpoint 1 and move it over here, and I'm going to rename this one checkpoint 2. Now you'll notice that I'm creating these checkpoints but I'm not adding them anywhere. I'm not referencing them from anything. And that's because I'm considering these checkpoints simply to be markers, and my level manager, as you'll see in an upcoming video, is going to loop through all those objects, all those checkpoint objects in our game, and use them to set up the scheme for our level. So instead of having to add all these checkpoints up into an array somewhere, we're going to automatically query for them at the level start. Okay, so I think that just about wraps up what I wanted to do here. The most important thing is that I was able to create all the classes that we're going to need for the upcoming level manager, particularly the level manager itself, the game manager, the game HUD, and the individual checkpoints. So we're definitely going to be using these methods or these mono behaviors in the upcoming videos. In addition, I created the game manager, or at least stubbed it out, and then I made sure to create the game skin, which the game skin is what we're going to use to control how we want our GUI elements to appear in the game. And then finally, I just placed some arbitrary checkpoints in our level so that we can see them work. All right, I think that about wraps up this video. We'll see you guys in the next one.